visual neurophysiologist, which means I try to figure out how we see by recording from neurons from nerve cells throughout the visual system. But I've come to realize that artists also try to figure out how we see, and many works of art are important because they've figured out or revealed important things about how our visual system works. So artists, for a really long time, have used line drawings, to portray scenes in the world. And it's so intuitive and so well accepted that you have to step back and think for a minute that the world is not full of lines. There are no lines out there in the world. There are contours and discontinuities, and yet we accept a line drawing as a perfectly good representation of a contour. That's because of the way our visual system processes light. So if you shine a spot of light on the retina, you'll get a barrage of signals from the retinal ganglion cell. But if you make that spot of light bigger, paradoxically, you get a worse response. And Steve Kufler figured out that that's because retinal ganglion cells are excited by light by one part of the visual field, but they're inhibited by light in the immediate surround. So if he shined an annulus of light on the retina, he got a suppression of signaling. We call this center-surround antagonism or center-surround suppression, and it is the most fundamental stage of visual information processing. And in case you don't believe me that your visual system is full of center-surround cells, do you see the little gray dots everywhere where you're not looking? And don't worry about why it's where you're not looking, because that's postgraduate. You see the little gray spots because center-surround cells at the intersections have more light in their inhibitory surround, so they're less activated than the cells here, so they look a little bit darker. In order to get this surround inhibition, you have to have one extra step in the process, so there's a tiny delay between the center and the surround. Sorry, this extra inhibitory synapse between the excitation and inhibition. So you can see that delay here in this scintillating version of the same illusion. Yeah, those spots are illusory, believe me. So if you get anything out of this evening, from what I'm saying anyway, please take home the message that vision is information processing. It's not image transmission. It doesn't do you any good to send a high-resolution image up to your visual cortex because there is nobody up there to look at an image. All you have up there is nerve cells, and all they can do is signal or not signal. So that means that these computations are simple. They're nerve cells. All they do is signal or not signal. Local, they're nerve cells. They're tiny. And often these signals are opponent. One nerve cell can either excite or inhibit the other. And if they inhibit each other, you get opponents. So if you have an image like this, white on one side, dark on the other, center surround cells over here are inhibited, center surround cells over here are not active. It's only center surround cells at the discontinuity that signal, where there's an imbalance between the center and the surround. So center surround cells turn a contour into a line. The image that you look at is mapped onto your retina because of optics, but then it is further mapped onto your visual cortex so that there's a map in your early visual cortex of what you're looking at. All long-range connections in the cortex are excitatory. All inhibitory connections are local. So all this inhibition has to occur locally in your visual field, which means it has to happen to nearby parts of your visual field. And so you can see manifestations of this in something like luminance, your appreciation of luminance. Now, all these disks are identical. And I know they don't look identical. They don't look identical to me, but I know they are because I made this using Adobe Photoshop. What's changing is the luminance of the background. Your visual system does not care about the luminance at any point in the visual scene. All it cares about is contrast because of this fundamental computation of center surround antagonism. But it's true for more than just luminance. It's true for contrast in general. So these checks are identical to these, but these look higher and these look lower contrast because these are surrounded by high and these are surrounded by low. It's true of orientation. So these center stripes are vertical, but they look off vertical because of the opponency of the surround. It's true of motion. That red dot really is moving vertically. I know it doesn't look like it's moving vertically, but it looks like it's moving off vertical because of the motion in the surround. Color shows surround inhibition, so all these rings are exactly the same shade of gray. I know they are because I made this. What's changing is the background color. And so these look more blue, that is less yellow, and these look more yellow, that is less blue, because of surround opponency in color. And here's a little illusion based on that. If you look at this black dot, this is Joseph Albers invented this for the artists in the audience. If you look at that black dot for just a few seconds and think about the fact that you're looking at white letters, I hope you'll be a little surprised to get a yellow letter after image from white letters. But again, that's because of the surround opponency in color. And of course, artists know this. Monet painted a blue shadow with yellow surround highlights. So I've showed you a lot of different ways in which your computations of various aspects of vision are locally opponent, but this goes on to even higher level things that you might not imagine would be locally opponent. Something as complicated as depth perception is local and opponent. So you look out in this room and it looks vividly three-dimensional, right? You have to agree with me. Yes. Now, I know it is three-dimensional. I'm not going to disagree with that. But the fact that it looks three-dimensional comes from two flat retinal images. That's all you get, two flat retinal images. Your visual system has to compute this perception of distance and depth, and you use a lot of cues to do that. Things like relative motion, so when things move more, they seem like they're closer than things that move less relative to your head. Shading, perspective, occlusion, and stereopsis, which I won't get to, which is the difference in the image in the two eyes. So your brain uses all these various cues to compute distance and depth. And you can pay a lot of money for a ray tracing program, and I think most computer gamers and video graphics people use these. You don't need to. You don't need to pay all that money because your visual system computes distance and depth using a bunch of local cues, and it just concatenates all these local cues. And artists for centuries have been ignoring the laws of physics. You don't go around making sure the laws of physics are being obeyed. It's a given. But artists have painted shadows going in crossing directions. Here's a vase of flowers casting a shadow towards the sun. This is Canaletto's Piazza San Marco. It's at the museum at Harvard. And the people on this side of the piazza have their shadows going in this direction, and the people on this side of the piazza, the shadows are going in the other direction. So I was pointing this out in an interview once, and one of the docents came over and said, that's because the light comes in here and bounces off this building, and so that's why So I went to the Piazza San Marco. There is no time of, this building is just a bunch of windows and columns and stuff. There is no time of day in which the shadows on the piazza go in opposite directions. Nobody cares. You would think that this thing would cast a shadow somewhere. Here's a manger where the roof is seen from above on this side and from below on this side. Nobody cares. Now, I do not contend that halos should necessarily obey the laws of physics, but you'd think that they'd at least be consistent about whether they occlude something or not. And of course, Magritte plays with the laws of occlusion, which is fun. If you want to see the laws of physics not being obeyed in a painting, find a picture of somebody looking in a mirror. I guarantee you it's not going to obey the laws of physics. If this lady were looking at herself in the mirror, which is what the context of the painting suggests, you, the viewer, would not see her face, right? Even Vermeer, he paints this shiny brass bowl, and the bowl looks shiny because it seems to be reflecting the tablecloth underneath, but if you look closely, it doesn't even match. Nobody cares. So something else that artists figured out way before us neuroscientists is that color and luminance do different things for you. And by luminance, for the artists in the audience, I mean value. But I'm going to define it anyway. So we have three types of daylight photoreceptors, cones, just 3, only 3. We see thousands of colors, but we do it using 3 cones. Short, middle, and long, or red, green, and blue. And we see color by opponency, by subtracting the activity in pairs of these cones. We see luminance by just summing the activity in different cones. And so in this image, after Joseph Albers, this is the color version, this is the luminance or value version. Most color contrasts also carry a luminance contrast, but you can have color contrasts that don't carry a luminance contrast, and when you do, very weird and special things happen. So this is, an artist had figured this out. This is Monet's Impression Sunrise. It's the painting after which the Impressionist movement got its name. It's at the Marmottan in Paris. It's really worth seeing. The sun looks absolutely brilliant. It shimmers. It's hot and cold, light and dark, but it looks really bright. And I once got a small grant from Harvard to go to Paris to measure the luminance in Impression Sunrise. And it turns out that despite the fact that this sun looks really bright, it's actually exactly the same luminance as the gray sky background. And I think it's because, so Harvard has another version of this where the sun is brighter than the sky. It looks much worse. I think it's the fact that it's exactly the same luminance, exactly the same value that gives it this weird, bright, shimmery quality. And that is because of the way your visual system, the primate visual system in general, is organized. So light comes into the retina, it's projected up to the primary visual cortex, and then it divides into these 2 major processing streams that do very different things. And we know what these different streams do because of what happens to people who get lesions in different parts of their brain, often by high-velocity bullets, which turn out to be a real, I don't want to say benefit, but useful to neurologists in figuring out what parts of the brain are for. So people who get lesions or strokes sometimes in this part of the visual system, the ventral part of their visual system, lose the ability to recognize objects. They can draw the objects, they can see the objects, they can manipulate the objects, but they can't recognize what they are. So we call this the what system, because it's for recognizing what things are. The dorsal part of our visual system is evolutionarily old. So this part of our visual system is new to primates. Among mammals, only primates have a well-developed what system. But this older system we sometimes call the where system because it carries information about motion and depth and figure ground segregation. Some people call it a how system because it's like how you interact with your environment, but you have to know where things are in order to interact with them. So here are some drawings made by patients with lesions in their where system. These patients were asked to draw a bicycle, a cross, and a clock. So you can see that they get all the bits right, but the bits are just not in the right spatial organization, kind of like a cubist drawing, which is not to say that Picasso had a parietal lobe lesion, but rather that he figured out how separate these things can be. But for what I want to talk about now, your where system, your evolutionarily old part of your visual system, is, like other mammals, essentially colorblind. So I want to try to convince you that your ability to see motion, depth, spatial organization, and figure ground segregation are carried by a colorblind part of your visual system. So if you have a red spot on a green background and you take a black and white photograph of it, you get a gray spot on a gray background, right? And you can imagine that you could change the relative brightness of the red spot in such a way that you got the same gray, right? That's equal luminance. That's equal value. And weird things happen at equal value. So for me, this one has that weird shimmery quality. And this one, for me, people's equal value point differs, especially with age. So you probably see a completely different shimmery one than I do. But I want to try to convince you now that your ability to see depth, spatial organization, and figure ground segregation are carried by a colorblind part of your visual system. And to do this, I'm going to show you some rotating spots. There they are. Okay, now, this is a little tricky. I have to get the red bright, and then I have to get the green dark. So I hope this thing looks three-dimensional to you. It's not, right? We know that. Now I forget which one is it. And it looks three-dimensional whether the red spots are darker than the green or brighter than the green. But I hope I can go through whoa. Damn it. Sometimes it stops on me, you see. All right, now I got to go through this again. I make the red bright. I make the green dark. And now let's go through equal luminance. Darker, it's three-dimensional. And now let's see if I can get it flat and squishy. See, I got flat and squishy. And then it gets three-dimensional again. Do you see that? Let's do it one more time before it quits. Flat and squishy. And three-dimensional. So that's your failure to see depth from motion at equal luminance. I think I have to hit escape. Right, I knew that. So put the glasses down. Come on. No. Now just look at this thing. Come on, just wait. Take my word for it, okay? You can see that this thing has depth from shading and depth from perspective, or cues to depth from shading and depth from perspective. What I want you to do, and do we have enough glasses? Close one eye and look through the red lens, okay? And then I hope this thing looks more three-dimensional. Close one eye and look through the red lens with the open eye. I'm sorry. It's past my bedtime. All right, now everybody has to put your glasses down, okay? Please put the glasses down. Please, come on. Come on, there you go, thank you. Now here's another one, but before you put on the glasses, I want you to think about how much depth can you see from perspective, can you even do figure ground segregation? Can you figure out what's going on in this image? And now close one eye and look through the red lens. All that does is introduce a luminance contrast by blocking the blue light. Doesn't it look more three-dimensional? Okay, now you can do whatever you want with the glasses, because it isn't going to make any difference for a while. So Monet painted a whole bunch of versions of this cathedral in Rouen. And they're all about how light bounces off this beige stone building. And you can see all the depth that's there in the rose window in the doorway. It's there in the Luminance version alone. In some of his versions, particularly this one that's at the MFA in Boston, it looks flat and shimmery. And I think it's sunset, and the building faces west. And so he managed to achieve this flat, shimmery quality where there is no luminance contrast, because the sun is streaming directly in, by using colors that are equal value. And here's another version of the Rouen Cathedral by Lichtenstein. And this one doesn't even look like the Rouen Cathedral until you close one eye and look through the red lens. And there it is. And of course, Andy Warhol loves to play with equal luminance, right? So he's got this poster of the Brooklyn Bridge. And the lower half of the poster, you can hardly figure out what's going on because there's no luminance contrast between the pink and the green. But in the top half, he's got a luminance contrast of exactly the same image, and you see a lot more depth. There are maybe 5 of us here who remember Gracie Slick. But there was this poster, and it doesn't even look like Gracie Slick until you introduce a luminance contrast. And of course, Andy Warhol loves to play with, and the electric chair looks very different at equal luminance. So if your ability to see depth from shading, depth from perspective is carried by a colorblind part of your visual system, the corollary is that it doesn't matter what color you use as long as the luminance is appropriate. And of course, artists know this. This is André Derain's portrait of Matisse. And the planes of his face are weird colors, but if you knew Matisse, you'd recognize him, because even though the colors are weird, they're exactly the right luminance to convey the three-dimensional shape of his face. And of course, Matisse, with this lady in a hat that everybody thought was so horrible at the time, he was doing what Picasso says. He's using colors symbolically, but the reality, the shape of her face, is there in the luminance alone. So I hope I've convinced you that your ability to see depth, spatial organization, and figure ground segregation are carried by a colorblind part of your visual system. Now I want to try to convince you that your ability to see motion is also colorblind. And again, I got to come up with one of these video things here. Let's see if this one works. Okay, now I need to slow it down a little. Now you can cheat if you want and look at the middle, but I recommend looking over here to experience what it is I want to show you, which is that the stripes seem to move at the same speed if the green is darker than the red, if the green is brighter than the red, but I can get the stripes on the left to slow down by making them close to equal luminant. Don't look at the center, look off to the side, and I hope you, so that is now a suboptimal stimulus to your motion system because it has very little luminance contrast, and I hope it seemed to move more slowly. So if your ability to see motion is colorblind, your ability to see that something is stationary is also colorblind. And a lot of art historians carry on about the motion that you see in Monet's paintings, and I think that's because he often used equal value colors. So these poppies are the same value as the grass, and so your what system can see them, but your where system can't, and so their position is indeterminate. They can seem to move in the breeze. His water is often many different equal luminant colors, and it can seem to flow. Now, Monet never talked about achieving motion. It's the art historians afterwards who talk about it. But Mondrian titled this thing Broadway Boogie Woogie. He knew he had achieved a sense of motion in this painting. The original's at the MoMA in New York. It's about this big across, and it's absolutely nauseating how it jumps around. And I think the reason it jumps around is because the checks are visible, the yellow checks are visible to your what system, but your where system can't see them. So it's not clear where they are. Advertisers do this all the time, right? Wired magazine, you'll find a headline or an ad. You're not supposed to use the glasses. And I think advertisers do this because the jumpy, moving quality of the text is attention-getting, and it's also very hard to read. And I think that that's a benefit to advertisers. So I hope I've convinced you that your ability to see motion, depth, spatial organization, and figure ground segregation are colorblind and calculated locally in your visual cortex. Now I want to try to convince you that your ability to see color is low resolution. So of course, artists know this. Watercolor artists, pastel artists will often have an outline, a high luminance contrast outline, and then a color that essentially they don't color inside the lines. And they've figured out that this works, but it works because of the low resolution of your color system. So I hope you see the donut as yellower than the whole or the background. You have to agree with me now. Yes. Okay, I see it that way too, but I know it's not because I made this. It's not, really. This is exactly the same white as that and that. This is a yellow line inside a blue line, but because of the low resolution of your color system, the color spreads until it hits the next border. Now I want to show you, I want to make some after images so that you can watch your own blurry colors spread until it hits a border. So what I want you to do is look at that intersection right there of those three shapes, and then I'm going to show you a achromatic gray background. Now do it again, look at the intersection, and see if you don't see a better color after image in this achromatic. Did you see a better one? Now some of you are thinking, well, of course you did it twice, right? That's not why. Look at the intersection, evaluate the after image, look at the intersection, evaluate the after image. Now there's another version. Look at the intersection and see if you can get that color to fill a completely different shape. And now look at the intersection and watch the color just squirt right out the hole. So when I was writing this book about vision and art, I had this editor who pointed out that it was obvious I knew a lot about vision, and I do, but it was equally obvious I knew nothing about art history. And so he got me to read Gombrich, which is a very good art history book. But I only got to the Renaissance because Gombrich said, I want you to look at the Mona Lisa. There is a reason why everybody loves this painting, why it is so famous. And it has to do with the fact that she really looks like she's alive. Her expression changes as you look at this painting. So I looked at it and I thought, oh my goodness, he's right. Except as a visual physiologist, I knew. So what I noticed is that when you look at her eyes and think about how much she's smiling, she seems to be smiling more than when you look directly at her mouth. Try looking back and forth between her eyes and her mouth, her eyes and her mouth. Does her expression change systematically depending on where you're looking? So that's not, so Gombrich and all these art historians say that's because Leonardo used sfumato, that is, he made it blurry. But, and therefore her smile's ambiguous. But ambiguity couldn't explain why her expression changes systematically depending on where you're looking. That is really low-level stuff. And I happen to know that your acuity changes dramatically with eccentricity. So if you're fixating on that spot, all these letters are equally readable. That's how much your acuity changes from your center of gaze. So your center of gaze is really good at seeing little tiny details, and your peripheral vision is bad at it. That's why you have to move your eyes when you read. You can't resolve all the letters at once, right? But your peripheral vision is not just a bad version of your central vision. Your peripheral vision is better at seeing big, blurry things. So if you filter the Mona Lisa in such a way that you see what she would look like to your peripheral vision, she's grinning from ear to ear. But if you filter her in such a way that you can see what she'd look like to your central vision, if you could see the whole thing at once with your central vision, which of course you can't, she's much more somber. And I think, so you have to move your eyes constantly. If you don't move your eyes, your vision fades. And so as you move your eyes around this painting, her expression changes, giving a dynamic quality to this painting. And 500 years ago, a dynamic quality was something pretty special in a painting. And it also, I think, gives it this coy quality that Gombrich mentions. You're looking at the trees, and you notice she's smiling, and you really fast try to look at her to catch her smiling, and she stops. Now, I thought I discovered this. I even have a paper published on it, but I found out last month that Andy Warhol probably saw it too. Look at this. She's grinning from ear to ear. She's hardly smiling at all, depending on how much paint was left in his silk screen or whatever it is he uses. So I think the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists also achieved a dynamic quality in their works of art by using the differences in acuity to your central and peripheral vision. So the pointillists themselves thought that the vibrant quality of the colors in their paintings was due to additive color mixing. The fact that you put dabs of different color paint next to each other on the canvas instead of smearing them together on the palette. But there's nothing special about magazine illustrations, and they're made up of little dots of color, so they use additive color mixing. Instead, I think the vibrant quality of the colors in post-impressionist painting comes from the fact that your central vision sees the dots, your peripheral vision sees the boat, the river, the trees, and wherever you're looking, you see the dots, and the rest of the thing merges into a recognizable form. And so as you move your eyes around, things change. That's vibrant. And if you're looking at this reflection, you see dots. If you look a little bit farther away, you see lines. If you look still farther away, you see a solid. That's what real water does. It changes depending on where you're looking. And of course, Chuck Close carries this to an extreme, with your central vision seeing the tiles and your peripheral vision seeing Chuck Close. Photomosaics. Your central vision sees baseball cards. Your peripheral vision sees Babe Ruth. So now I want to talk about recognizing objects. How do we do that? We, primates, are very good at recognizing faces. You're seeing these faces in 1/10 of a second. You're recognizing them as faces. You're even figuring out which individuals they are. And you can do this whether these are degraded or caricatured or obscured, and you can do this better than any computer program. How is it that we're so good at recognizing faces? We're extraordinarily good at recognizing faces. But again, artists have been thousands of years ahead of us neuroscientists in trying to understand what's important about recognizing a face. And artists have discovered that a caricature is much easier to recognize than a veridical line drawing. Now, why should a caricature, which looks less like the original, somehow more accurately evoke that individual than a veridical line drawing? So we study face processing. We study it in monkeys because monkeys, like humans, use faces to recognize particular individuals and to convey important social information. So both monkeys and humans have dedicated parts of the what system for processing faces. We know this because humans can get lesions in parts of their ventral stream and lose the ability to recognize faces, even though they can recognize all other kinds of objects. Nowadays, we can see this using functional MRI. You can have these parts of the brain that light up in the scanner. Monkeys also have face patches, just like we do, and we have recorded from face patches to say, what do these cells care about? What do they code? What do they respond to? And what we discovered is that in these face patches, you have a whole bunch of cells that respond whenever you show the animal a face. Any kind of a face, a monkey face, a human face, a cartoon face. Anything you would call a face, these cells in monkey infratemporal cortex will respond. And so we use the fact that they respond to cartoon faces to try to probe what they care about. So you can recognize a bunch of faces. How do you do this? Do you have one cell for every face that you recognize? Probably not. That's going to be a lot of cells. It's also a pretty complicated thing to wire up. Instead, maybe what we asked was, do cells care about variables? Do they care about parameters? So we varied everything we could think of. We varied the shape of the face, the shape of the eyebrows, the hair, the mouth, the nose. We varied everything we could think of. And we recorded from neurons that, whoops, I missed that. Come on, I was supposed to do this. I have to go in the right order here. Come on. There, that's what it looked like. So we were trying to define face space. We went what we thought would be way outside of acceptable primate face space, right? We took these parameters to the extreme, thinking that we would have a subset of parameters in the middle that these cells would care about. So this is the only science you have to look at today, okay? These are 3 face cells. Each column is one variable. And you can see, so the blue thing is a graph of how the cells firing varied depending on the setting of that parameter. So for example, this cell was excited by small inner eye distance. So the eyes were really close together and the cell liked it. And it's inhibited by big inner eye distances and so on. So what you can see is that each of these cells cares about a few variables. And the 3 cells care about different sets of variables. So you could imagine you could have a population of face cells that would define all the variables that describe a face. The other thing that we realized is you can imagine that if you had a cell that cared about inner eye distance, you might want to have cells that peaked in their response to various plausible inter-eye distances, right? Or you could have 2 cells. One that responded to really big inner eye distances and was inhibited by small, and then an opposite cell that was excited by small inner eye distances and inhibited by big. This is more efficient. You only need 2 cells because you get everything in between from the ratio of these 2 cells. And sure enough, you can see that that's what we saw. We saw ramp-shaped tuning, even though we tried really hard to get outside of plausible ranges of these variables. So ramp-shaped tuning in face space means that face cells code how a face differs from the average, right? Does that make sense? It's got this ramp-shaped tuning. It's more and more and more the farther away you get from the average. That's what caricature is, right? What's a caricature? You figure out how a face differs from the average and you exaggerate it. And of course, even great artists know this. These are a bunch of portraits by Picasso, but I've put, and they're weird the way Picasso portraits tend to be, but I've put them next to the person they're a portrait of. They're all caricatures. So this is Gertrude Stein, Picasso himself, Igor Stravinsky, his art dealer, some guy he roomed with, wife, wife of a friend, girlfriend, mother-in-law. He's figured out what is unique about each of these individuals, and he's exaggerated it, right? In addition, ramp-shape tuning in face space means that face coding, which is a very high-level visual process, it's way beyond the early visual stuff I talked about earlier, but it has in common with those calculations that it is local and opponent. You remember I told you all about the local and opponent calculations that happen in early visual cortex? The same calculations happen in higher visual cortex. What do I mean? Well, I told you that in early visual cortex, it's a map of visual space. So nearby neurons code nearby visual space. That's why you have surround in visual space. But when you get to higher visual cortex, neurons are clustered according to what they code for. So you may have a cluster of neurons that code for faces here, bodies here, places here. So that means that nearby neurons aren't coding nearby visual space, they're coding nearby face space. So you should have after effects in face recognition the same way you have, if you look at a red spot, you see a green after image, you look at a white spot, you see a black after image. So what I want you to do right now is look at these little numbers, okay? And the reason I want you to look at these little numbers is because I want you to get a face identity after image, but I don't want it to be a stupid little low-level retinal after image. I want it to be a high-level face identity after image. So now I'm going to show you two identical morphs. I hope you have a face identity after image. So at every stage, vision is information processing, but the same local simple computations go on at every stage. And artists take advantage of this, but we can also see this processing in the work of artists. You can see it in the art of children. If you ask a 3-year-old child to draw a person, you will get a face on legs. Any 3-year-old child. The child is telling you what's important about a person, right? That's the information the child has taken in. That's the information the child gives back. This is a drawing a child made of her pregnant mother. A face on legs inside of a face on legs. And in honor of this being a talk for the Leakey Foundation, do you remember this 45,000-year-old figurine that, if you listen to the experts, has great symbolic and fertility value? And I'm sitting here thinking, if you ask a male, what are the important parts of a female, this is what you'll get. Matisse says this explicitly. He says, I don't paint things, I paint the differences between things. So one time I was invited to participate in some kind of panel at an exhibition at the Museum of Art and Design on dioramas. Remember dioramas, middle school? I almost didn't go. But I went, and I was really glad I did, because these artists were making things, they were making scenes that were absolutely exquisite, even when they were scenes that were banal or kind of disturbing. They were still exquisite. And so in talking to these artists, I always try to figure out what artists are saying. And because I am a scientist and because they are artists, we have a communication gap. It's nobody's fault. We just use different words for things. These artists kept saying, I am trying to get the viewer to see things differently. And I kept thinking to myself, what are they saying? Why do they all keep saying I'm trying? Then I thought about what I've been working on, which is the modular organization of the ventral stream. So we know from neurology that people can get a selective loss of the ability to recognize surprisingly specific categories of objects. So people can lose the ability to recognize faces, places, text, bodies, or tools. That means that there are dedicated regions in your infratemporal cortex that process those categories. And we can see this in fMRI. We have regions for faces, places, text, bodies, and tools. Having a domain for processing a particular category of objects makes you an expert at it because you have nearby cells all coding the same thing, and they can inhibit each other because, as I said before, remember, inhibition is local. So being able to do fine comparisons within a category makes you really good at it. Now, you probably think, oh, yeah, I'm okay at faces. Maybe I'm not so great at faces. You are a real face expert. There are a couple people here who are not, but they know who they are. It's okay. So you know what I've done here. This is the Thatcher illusion, right? This isn't Margaret Thatcher, but when Peter Thompson invented it, he did it with Margaret Thatcher. You know what I've done, right? You're a sophisticated audience, and yet I bet you when I turn this right, but you're processing this with your non-face cortex because it doesn't qualify as an intact, typical upright face. Now you're going to process it with your expert cortex. That's how expert you are at processing things for which you have a special category. Now, when artists make stuff at the wrong scale, I think they manage to tap into getting you to look at it with a different part of your brain. They are literally getting you to see it differently. And I think even putting things in the wrong place does the same thing. Gets you to look at something different. You don't process it in the same way. Now, I've seen this before. You've seen it before. It's exactly, can you see it the way you saw it before? Isn't that amazing? That's how good you are at it. So I hope I've convinced you that artists have figured out a lot of important stuff. I am particularly interested in talking to artists about stuff that they've figured out because we have a lot in common. And I'm perfectly happy to do whatever Q&A thing we want to do now.